everyone, this is our presentation of the impact of emotional trauma on the brain by Danica, Arushi, Mina, and Elysiani. So just for a brief overview before we actually get into the presentation, today we're going to be talking about brain structures affected by emotional trauma, the subtypes of trauma and how they can each impact the brain, related traumas and their effects, trauma and neurochemical changes, specifically the neurochemicals cortisol, serotonin, and norepinephrine, the long-term psychological effects of trauma and the responses to trauma, neuroplasticity, how the brain can change with healing, therapy, meditation, and other forms of support, real-life connections, and finally, our conclusion and sources. When someone undergoes emotional trauma, their brain physically changes. These changes are caused by three major neurochemicals: cortisol, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Starting with cortisol, cortisol is the primary stress hormone. In normal situations, cortisol can help us respond to stress by increasing our energy and focus. But after trauma, especially repeated or prolonged trauma, this system can go haywire and get dysregulated. Some people can develop chronically high cortisol levels, leading to anxiety, restlessness, sleep disturbance, weak bones, irritability, fatigue, and many more other symptoms. Others, particularly those with PTSD, can experience abnormally low cortisol, which can contribute to fatigue, emotional numbing, and poor stress recovery. Both extremes disrupt the body's ability to regulate itself, which is part of why emotional trauma symptoms are so hard to manage. Additionally, cortisol can also interfere with the hippocampus and cause memory gaps. Moving on to our next neurochemical, serotonin. Serotonin plays a major role in regulating mood, impulse control, and sleep. Trauma can reduce the production and effectiveness of serotonin, which is why trauma survivors often struggle with depression, irritability, and impulsivity. This connection was the focus of a 2008 review by Seo, Patrick, and Kenna, published in Human Psychopharmacology, Clinical and Experimental. They found that trauma-related stress can significantly reduce serotonin transmission in the brain. Their study also explored how this decrease in serotonin is linked to increased emotional reactivity and impaired impulse control, especially in individuals with a history of violence or abuse. This can help explain why some trauma survivors experience not only mood instability, but also outbursts of anger, aggression, or self-destructive behavior. All of this is rooted in disrupted neurochemical regulation. According to the study, trauma can essentially rewire the brain's ability to process and respond to emotional stimuli. Low serotonin levels can make it harder for individuals to calm themselves down, regulate negative thoughts, or feel emotionally stable. And finally, our last neurochemical is norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is another neurochemical impacted by trauma. It's responsible for the brain's alertness system. During trauma, norepinephrine spikes help the body to stay hyper-aware of danger. This also, again, ties into the fight or flight response like cortisol. But long after the event ends, trauma survivors often remain in that hyper-alert state, rather than having levels return back to normal. This can lead to hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, and exaggerated startled responses. High norepinephrine can also contribute to intense and intrusive memories, which is why certain sounds, smells, or sights can instantly trigger intense PTSD flashbacks. Norepinephrine can also impact your cardiovascular system. If levels are too high, which is often experienced for trauma survivors, this can result in anxiety, a rapid heart rate, high blood pressure, and hypertension, all of which can also contribute to cardiovascular disease. Essentially, norepinephrine keeps the body in threat mode long term. All of these different changes in neurochemicals can help us understand why healing from trauma requires more than just medication or talking it out. Recovery includes retraining the brain's chemistry and nervous system, and we'll go more into recovery later in the presentation.
I'm Danica, and I will be talking about brain structures affected by emotional trauma. Emotional trauma alters the stress response system. Specifically, the key regions impacted include the hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex. All these areas involve memory, fear, and regulation. Trauma disturbs our neuroendocrine responses. That's like cortisol, which then harms the brain functions and structure. The earlier trauma starts, the more severe and likely a person will develop long-term emotional, cognitive, and physical health problems. These problems are due to the impaired development and stress regulation system. The subtypes of trauma and how each impact the brain. The two main types of trauma stem from neglect and abuse. Neglect is seen to increase network transmission efficiency in areas of our brain responsible for cognitive and executive functions, the frontal lobe and insular cortex. It is associated with alterations in the right anterior superior temporal gyrus, a region implicated in processing social and emotional information. Abuse is seen to cause functional reorganization in the part of our brain that control emotional representation, which is visual, auditory, linguistic, and motor cortices. It also impacts the part of our brain mediated by an immature ego defense system. It is positively correlated with changes in the right lingual gyrus and left posterior middle temporal gyrus, areas related to visual processing and language comprehension. So, this slide features two images from the source that I found, the PubMed, and it basically shows you how each one, abuse and neglect, both impact the brain differently, and it shows just kind of more of the like scientific or like more of like physical evidence for you to actually see how each impact the brain. So starting off with emotional abuse, which will be the top right. So emotional abuse is connected to changes in the lingual gyrus and middle temporal gyrus areas. These are in visual and language processing. This suggests heightened sensitivity to emotional cues due to abuse. Emotional neglect, which is the bottom right, emotional neglect affects superior temporal gyrus. This area is tied to social cognition and empathy. This suggests a lack of ability to pick up social cues and struggles forming emotional connections. So, to continue on about other traumas that can impact you that aren't necessarily emotional, but are also just as impactful, you have the two different types of physical abuse, which consists of abuse and neglect, and then there's sexual abuse. So the physical abuse, the impacts of that are to the right inferior frontal gyrus, opercularis, and right supplementary motor cortex, affecting language processing and motor control. Physical neglect impacts the left posterior parahippocampal gyrus and left insular cortex, affecting emotional awareness and memory encoding. And then sexual abuse impacts the left posterior temporal fusiform cortex, affecting facial recognition and interpreting complex visual stimuli.
Hello, my name is Mina, and this is my part of the presentation. I will be discussing the long-term psychological effects and responses to trauma. I will be starting off with the four main psychological disorders, starting off with PTSD, which is a disorder that arises following exposure to an extremely stressful and possibly life-threatening events or series of events. PTSD is the most common long-lasting and harmful stress response to trauma, and it is dominated by negative emotions such as anxiety, fear, irritability, and depression. PTSD is frequently coexisted with various associated conditions, including depression, substance abuse, memory issues, and other physical, cognitive, mental health challenges. The next disorder is depression, which is a disorder that negatively influences how we think, feel, behave, and see the world. The next disorder is generalized anxiety, which induces fear, worry, and persistent overwhelm. The last disorder is borderline personality disorder, which is a mental health condition in which an individual exhibits a long-term pattern of volatile and intense emotion. And some symptoms and responses to trauma are traumatic reenactment, self-harm, disassociation, impaired memory and attention, low self-esteem, self-hatred, insecure, unhealthy attachments, persistent anger, night terrors, selective mutism. And these symptoms are broken down into 4 different types, which is emotional, physical, cognitive, and behavioral. I've already discussed some of the emotional symptoms, but it's anxiety, depression, emotional numbness, detachment, guilt or shame, mood swings, irritability. The second is physical symptoms, which include fatigue, insomnia, nightmares, muscle tension, changes in appetite, also rapid breathing. The third one is cognitive symptoms, which includes flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, difficulty thinking, confusion, disorientation, memory loss, just memory problems in general, hypervigilance, negative thoughts about self and the world. And the last one is behavioral symptoms, which is withdrawal from friends and activities and families, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, substance abuse, aggression, risk-taking, reckless behavior, which is also very common with bipolar BPD. And there's also changes in sleep or eating patterns, which is also very common within the 4 disorders that I mentioned earlier. Out of all of these, the biggest one, the most common symptom is substance abuse, and majority of individuals and patients have admitted that the consumption of alcohol, marijuana, and heroin, cocaine, has alleviated their PTSD symptoms, which reinforces the hypothesis that these individuals are utilizing these substances for self-medication. And that is the end of my presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Elisiane, and my part of the presentation is about recovery and neuroplasticity, or in other words, how the brain heals after emotional trauma. When we go through something painful, like a loss, abuse, or very stressful experience, our brain can be affected. But the good news is our brain can be changed. That is called neuroplasticity. It means that the brain can reorganize itself. It can form new neural connections, especially after trauma. That's how we can learn to adapt, recover, and feel better over time. Some important parts of the brain that are affected are the hippocampus, which help with memory, and the amygdala, which is connected to fear and emotions. After trauma, this area can change, especially with support and treatment. So, research shows that healing really changes the brain. For example, mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT therapy, help increase gray matter in the areas of the brain that control emotion. That is a study by Lazar et al. In 2005 that found people who practice medication had more thickness in the brain cortex. That means their brain actually changes. Also, Therapy helps the brain create new pathways, new ways to process emotion and deal with trauma. Healing is not just about the time, it's also about action. Therapy like CBT and eye movement desestabilization and reprocessing helps people reframe painful memories and build healthier responses. And medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors can support brain chemistry and make emotion more stable. And one of the important part is social support, having someone to talk to reduce stress and help recovery. We're not meant to heal alone. Real life connection. Have you ever felt better after talking to someone about something hard? That is not just emotional, that is your brain changing. When we talk, share, or feel understood, it helps our brain heal. So healing is not only about what happens in therapy, but also in self-conversion, journaling, and emotion support. In conclusion, trauma can hurt the brain, but healing is totally possible. Thanks to the neuroplasticity and with the help of therapy support and the time, the brain can rebuild. So, yes, the brain is strong, and with the hind tools, we can recover, grow, and feel better again. Thank you.
These are our sources. Thank you so much for watching.